What's up, guys? So we have some sweet glute information coming for you today. I, of course, am Joe Bennett, the hypertrophy coach, and this is Mei Ling, and I will let her introduce herself.
Hi, Mei Ling NG. You may see me on Wonder Woman, Scorpion King, and upcoming Suicide Squad manga. Play a lot of superheroes and warriors and martial artists. So look out for me.
Sweet. And we're going to be taking you guys through some glute stuff. We're going to have Mei Ling demoing, and hopefully you guys can learn some stuff and pick up some tips along the way. And check out both of our channels. Hit some like buttons, some subscribe buttons, share with some friends, and hopefully you guys enjoy the series.
Definitely subscribe to me. I know where you live. I'll come and find you.
She can beat you up. True story.
I will.
All right, so we're looking at more of a squat with the goal of training glutes. And so we've talked about a little bit. A lot of this footage after this part looking all neat and pretty, I'm gonna leave as is. So kind of the way that I was having Mei Ling squat here is different than how she's been cued to squat before. So anytime someone's learning anything new, there's a lot of cueing, there's a lot of figuring out like what can I say to try and get her to do basically what I want her to do, what makes sense, what clicks, what actually feels, whatever. And so we're gonna leave a bunch of that stuff in there for you guys because hopefully if something that helped her click will help somebody else click that's watching. But basically I say if you're training for like the physique goal of obviously why I wanna develop this body part or develop this body part, one of the big takeaways of all my content is you don't wanna think exercise, because if you just think I have to squat, then you basically think there's one version of squat. And so I was telling Mei Ling, most people in the physique world should have two different variations of squat. You want one that's a lot more quad dominant, and that's gonna look a lot more upright. I was saying, imagine that I have a heel elevation. It's gonna look more like this. And if you look at my knee joint, I'm going from basically fully extended to fully flexed. And my more upright torso is gonna be less hip flexion. And then again, for a more hip dominant one, you're gonna see that I'm pushing my hips way more back. I'm getting a ton of hip flexion, so hopefully you can see this angle here, and much less knee involvement. And so typically if I'm doing squats, it's one of those two. One is the goal for developing quads, one is the goal for developing hips. And a lot of people kind of get stuck in the middle. So we're talking about a lot of the cueing that people will see is to keep their chest up, and what will happen, again, I was telling Mei Ling, there's this kind of open scissor type thing, whereas if you're dropping down and you're hip flexing and you're keeping your chest up, the only way you can do that is by extending your spine as you go through the motion. And again, a big thing with glute training is you don't want to move your spine. You want to imagine that it's a piece of steel, it can't move, and it's basically just kind of coming along for the ride. And so again, the big thing that I was trying to cue here, where that really chest up thing comes from, I think, is the fact that when some people first start to squat, it just looks like this fold in halfy type thing. Like basically it's people are thinking, oh, I got to go down here. And so they basically bend at the hips a little bit. They round at their spine a little bit. Everything's loose. Where you do want your lower back and all the muscles along your spine tight, you want them keeping it fixed. But again, at the same time, you don't want it moving. If you just cue chest up enough, as you go down, what's happening is your back is just arching to maintain that position. And that's when a lot of people try and do squats, they feel their lower back a lot, they don't feel their hips as much. So basically what you want here is the focus is to put your hips back as far as you can. And basically again, if this was made of steel, again, your whole spine was made of steel, whatever angle you're going to hip flex, so if I'm hip flexing as far as I can, basically your whole spine should be at that same angle, which at the bottom is your chest is basically gonna be pointing towards the ground. And so that's really kind of the goal as of working with Mei Ling, is trying to get her hips as far back as possible, trying to get her as much hip flexion as possible. And if you're in this kind of squat position, the goal is one, ton of range of motion at the hips, but two, your hips are also very far away from the bar path. And the further away something is from that bar path, the more it's working. Whereas again, if I do that upright squat, my knees are going very far away from that bar path this way, which means my quads are gonna work a lot more. So let's try and do a couple of the finished product, hopefully where we've got it at now.
Okay.
And so again, for this, I like to use the box as a gauge for depth. I'm not actually having her unload on it. I'm basically just having her use the hips back, crunch that down just the teeniest bit. There we go. And you can see she has a ton of range of motion at the hips. The other thing I was trying to cue her to not do too much is to not do the ugly butt at the top. So I want her to stop right there. If she goes ahead and does that ugly butt thing at the top, you're basically contracting against no load. So go ahead and show me what I'm talking about. So a lot of people will do that as they come to the top of their squat. And basically you're just squeezing your glutes. You're not squeezing them against any load because that bar path is stacked over your hips at that point in time. Those look good. Just a little slower. Have you do one more. Hips back, hips back. Crunch those ribs down just a little bit. There we go. That looks really good. Nice. Okay. And so that was really the goal, is to try and make her squat a little bit more hip dominant, really get her hips back as far as possible, as much hip flexion as possible, which most of that wasn't new for her. But the other thing was to just kind of let her, torso stay with the rest of her torso.
That was new.
Yeah, and not have her basically feeling the need to extend up at the bottom. So we're working on, again, where is her chest facing at the bottom, not having it up, letting it face towards the ground. And the same with her head as well too. We're working on getting rid of, this position, the bottom. A lot of people want to look up at the bottom of the squat and realize if you're looking up at the bottom of the squat, this is the head position that you're in. You just can't tell because you're looking relative
Well, I was
to
trying
there.
to neutral, but you say I might kind of look down.
Yep.
Yeah, that's totally new.
Yep. Anything else?
I always think that if you look down, you collapse it.
Yeah.
But as you said, it's kind of more of a deadlift.
Yes.
Kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything else that helped you there? I mean, obviously they can hear all of our stuff going back and forth on that, but
The deadlift. As soon as you said it's a cross between a mix of the deadlift and the way that you close in. Then I got it.
Yeah, sweet. Yeah, so that's one of the cues we gave in there too, is a lot of people, again, it's when people get a little too attached to what's the name of the exercise that I'm doing, then it's hard to break free of those things. That's, again, a lot of people just think of squat as this uprighty, a lot of knee bendy type thing, and obviously a deadlift is all hips, but the reality is kind of what we're doing, a very hip dominant squat is kind of in between a squat and a deadlift. So I was even trying to cue just hips to start is a great way. So a lot of people almost start like a good morning if you want to help get a feel. So kind of good morning, and then the knees can bend, which will allow for more hip flexion as you're going into the bottom. But so I'm glad that cue helped on that one. Mm-hmm. Sweet. So enjoy a whole mess of stuff going in along here that kind of helped us get to that finished product, which I think will be hopefully very helpful because it's not always quick, neat, easy, and pretty. And again, hopefully some of the cues that we use will help you guys as well too. So when I'm going to have you do these, I'm going to have you do them just a light touch. So don't actually sit all the way back on them. So I really want you, instead of like a box squat, it's more of a squat to a box. If that makes any sense. Okay, so the only thing I'm going to have you do a little bit. So just for purposes here, go hands here. Crunch just a teeny bit. Too much. Up just a little bit, so just ribs down tight. And so now I want you to think, the first thing I want you to think, before you even bend your knees a whole lot, and we won't have it like this when you're actually going, but just think hips back. So do hips back first. And when your hips go back, let your chest, so imagine if I had an arrow attached to you this way, make sure that your chest is following the rest. So actually push your hips back and make your chest point that way. So again, actually go a little bit more forward. So think a little bit more. All I want you to do before you go down is think a little bit more deadlifty. So again, when you're squatting, I can see you're definitely have a little bit of focus on, I got to keep my chest up. So again, when you do this, if you watch my lower back, when I start down like this, when I go like that, my lower back's extending for my chest to stay up. So again, if my lower portion of my spine is starting to tip this way, if this comes along with it, it's going to point the same direction, if that makes sense. So I want you to think more. So again, think about when you deadlift, you let your chest just kind of folds right to the floor, right? So again, if I just imagine if I had little tiny arrows attached to every part of your spine. So again, if my lower back, if I'm going into hip flexion like this is going to point this way. Whereas if I go here and I'm staying extended, this is still going to point this way. Does that make sense? So again, when I was trying to say, if I had an arrow pointed, like attached to your chest pointing this way, as soon as you go down, it should just start pointing to the floor. So when you're at the bottom of your squat, again, yeah, your knees are going to bend, but it's going to be much more like this.
You want that?
Yes.
I always thought you want my back up.
No, so the only reason that people will cue that, which isn't a bad thing, depending on the squat variation you're doing. So if you're doing like a very quad dominant squat, like I would do with like a heel elevation or something, because of how far forward your knees are going to go, you can have this more upright squat. So again, if my goal is full knee flexion, so I have different types of squats. So this would be like a quad squat, but if I'm concerned with as much range of motion at the hips, it's going to be a much more foldy and halfy type squat. Not to get too technical, but if you imagine, so look at so again, if you can visualize, this is my pelvis and this is my femur. When I do like this upright squat, this is almost a 90-degree angle. So these two are like this. It's not that much range of motion. Where if I do the more kind of foldy and halfy type squat, I mean, this goes from 90 to whatever this angle is, so like 45 degrees. So again, I'm getting maybe 45 degrees more range of motion at the hips doing this kind of like...
I train about like lane and things like the running and stuff.
Yeah.
It's always about keeping your don't fall forward.
Well, so it depends on what's happening. So some people will fold forward from their spine rounding. So again, it's one of those tricky things. It's the same as like, imagine if you deadlifted, and I'm saying, you know, when you deadlift, it's gonna look like this. Like this is the bottom, like how we did the RDL, like your chest is pointing this way. I could make it point more this way if I went like this. So again, that's not the goal. I mean, so it's the same with squatting. If someone's squatting and they're going down, and as they get to the bottom, they just fold in half and go like this. There's a difference between a round. Yeah, so there's a difference between having a rounded spine and having a neutral spine, but being more folded in half.
What am I doing? I'm not folding. What am I doing?
So as you're going down to the bottom, I would like you more here. You're more here. Does that make sense? I did leg
weight
squats.
on the back?
So
is that okay to go forward? Like, isn't it just okay? Oh, I'm using a bar.
yeah, so I'll show you with the bar too. So you can see the difference. Like if I do this type of squat, so now look at my knee when I do this. So if I do this kind of folding halfy type squat like this, again, this is the bottom position that I want. My knee's at about a 9-degree angle, right? So there's not full knee flexion. Whereas if I was gonna do it, I would normally do like a heel elevation. I would do a squat like this. So now if I sit down, again, just imagine I have a heel elevation. This is full knee flexion. My hamstring is on my calf and I'm squatting like this. This is gonna have a very upright position because I'm not as hip flexed, if that makes any sense. So again, I would do, if I was squatting for quads, I would do this type of squat. And generally, like I said, I would have a heel elevation, so I'm actually capable of getting there. And if I was squatting for hips, glutes, adductors, whatever else, I would do this type of squat, if that makes sense. So when I'm doing it, the bar on my back, comfy stance. I probably have this box if it was me just a teeny bit higher because I'm running out of range of motion, but I would basically squat like this. This would be my bottom position. So again, my spine's not moving, so I'm not squatting like this. My spine is still like literally, so there's nothing, the muscles that keep you up, so again, you don't want to be extended like this, but if this is rounded, I want a neutral spine. My back is tight, so my upper back is tight, my lower back is tight, but again, it's just not moving. So as I go down, this is just the position that I want to be in, hips as far back as I can get them, and then up from there, as opposed to trying to keep it up like this. Start to fold in half, keep pushing the hips back, and then basically the squat stops when your hips can't go back any further.
Okay.
Try again without the bar once first.
I prefer with the bar because before I just didn't. Okay.
We'll get to the bar in a minute, I promise. So slow it down just a little bit. So tighten up here, do a little bit more of a crunch. Now don't let this out. So keep that crunched, and then now go ahead and just tap it. So think hips back, hips back, hips back. I feel like you're literally trying to make your hips touch the mirror. A little better, yep. All right, let's try with the bar. Crunch down. So as soon as you go to squat, your hips are moving back and you're going just like this. This is how your motion starts. If you can see my lower back, your motion starts like this. Okay. Low back extension. So again.
You filming now? I think you should film now. So then
yeah.
You're okay. So you've got him like telling me what to do. Okay.
So don't lose this. So feel this feeling. And again, if you as soon as you start to go at your hips, your chest is going to have to start to face the floor. So again, you're doing this. I don't want this. I want your hips to chop in half, and you're just going to start, chest is pointing towards the floor. A little better. Let it go more. Crunch those abs. There you go. That was it. Better there. That's a better position there. And I want you to think even a little bit more about pushing the hips back, crunch the abs down, there you go, and then hips back more. Push the hips to the wall, there you go. And now the only thing I want you to get rid of, rack that for a second. So this is one of the places where it's not bad, but in this case particularly, it's promoting more spine motion. Is a lot of those looked better as your hips were going back and you were letting your, so there were some where you're still doing like this at the bottom, and then I say crunch down, it would get you more like that, which is where I want you to be. But when you're coming to the top, this should be the stop right here. So when you come, forward. So yeah, so don't ugly butt here. Ugly butt. Yeah, there's no load at the top. So again, it's literally the same as me, because again, the joint, the load is now stacked over your joints. As you come to the top, like this is literally the same as you doing this with no load. It's not challenging them. You can feel it. just because you're flexing them, the same as you can feel it flexing them with no load against it. But the whole point of this exercise is a lot of load from the bottom through the mid-range. And then as you come to the top, just stop and then go back again. So again, I would go hips back, hips forward, halfway, hips back, hips forward. That makes sense?
Okay. Again?
Yep. Crunch down just a little bit and then do everything a little bit slower, because if you go fast, it's just going to go right back to how you were doing it. There we go. That's better.
Okay, so the breath used to make me go like this. Don't do that.
No. And again, it's not one of those things I would say it's just horrible or something, but it doesn't do anything. And just don't come quite that far forward. That was good. So slow, slow, slow. Come up and stop right there. There you go. Now hips back, hips back. Yep. If anything, stop not quite as low. So hips back, hips back. I'll just fix the box right there. Let's go one more like that.
And back forward as well.
Right, yep. Good. Take a break. Obviously, a squat has a more upright torso position, and there's a lot more knees, where a deadlift traditionally is way more hips and maybe a little bit of knees. So really almost like that, this type of squat is somewhere between, you know, a deadlift and what someone would think about as a squat. And again, from like the trying to change your body world, that's the way that I'm thinking, where a lot of people are just taught, like, it's not a bad thing that people are taught to keep their chest up, because again, like someone that's brand new, like when people want to squat when they're brand new, it just kind of turns into this. It's just like everything just folds and everything moves. So to try and get people, like, and I do it, like I teach some of my little kids when I'm teaching them to squat, they'll just go like this, you know, they just kind of go down and they round. So it's a cue that was not for a bad reason. It's trying to keep some rigidity, keep these muscles tight. But then because everyone has different proportions as well too, a lot of it's based on people that are really naturally good at squats have really short femurs and longer torsos. So their squats just look more upright. And like people are like, oh, that looks good. And because it looks good, people think everybody should squat like that. But
well, that's interesting when you said this, it's a blend of a squat and a deadlift. That makes sense when you say it like that.
Yep.
What would you call that then? What kind of squat is that?
A hip dominant squat.
Hip dominant squat.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the reality too, we could always draw something on the board. Maybe it will help you see. But so if you have the bar path, whatever joint is the furthest away from it is going to work the most. And so the point is, if you imagine on the bar path, if you're doing a more upright squat, your knees are going pretty far away from it this way. And if your knees are ever going forward, like your hips are going to be closer to the bar. So that's why I kept saying hips back. If this is the bar path, literally the further back they get, the more they're doing the load.
See, that I'm used to. It's the chest going down.
Yep.
It's totally new to me.
Yeah. And so the reality is, if you're getting your hips very far back, so hopefully you can kind of see this, like if I can push my hips back really far and keep my chest up, but the only way for that to happen is for this to really extend. So again, for me to go down, hips back, keep the chest up, like I can almost kind of like make this look like, okay, my hips are back, but I'm really extended. So it just comes into being a lot of spine motion, which is just generally going to make you feel your lower back way more. And eventually it could limit it, because again, if I'm just trying to keep up and I'm going here, I mean, if I just let this kind of fold, I might even be able to get my hips back farther. This is more hip flexion here than if I'm trying to stay in this position, if that makes sense. So again, the further the hips back are back, the better. And then also the more actual hip flexion you're getting is better. Because again, if you're just trying to keep up, you might actually limit how much you can actually, get down in there.